It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Sir Michael Marmot. Michael is Professor of Epidemiology and Public Health and Director of the Institute of Health Equity at University College London. He is also President of the World Medical Association and President of the British Lung Foundation. He has worked long and hard at the highest levels of policy and governance to bring adequate medical care to everyone, everywhere, regardless of status, income, or location. He is the principal investigator of the Whitehall II studies of British civil servants that is seeking explanations for the striking inverse social gradient in morbidity and mortality. He leads the English longitudinal study of aging, and he is involved in several international research efforts on the social determinants of health. Among previous appointments, he was chair of the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. He led the British government's strategic review of health inequalities in England post-2010 and served as leader of WHO's European Review of Social Determinants of Health. He also was president of the British Medical Association and vice president of the Academia Europaea. Among many honors, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, and he delivered the 2006 Harveyan Oration of the Royal Society of Physicians, initiated by William Harvey in 1656 and given annually since then. He's also the recipient of the Balzan Prize for Epidemiology and the Grand Prize for Health Services Research. He holds a Lowndes Professorship at Harvard, and he is a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, an Honorary Fellow of the British Academy, and of the Faculty of Public Health of the Royal College of Physicians, and he is a Foreign Associate Member of the Institute of Medicine. He is the author of numerous scientific articles, countless policy documents, and several books. He earned a BSc in medicine and an MBBS in clinical medicine and surgery at the University of Sydney, and an MPH and PhD in epidemiology at UC Berkeley. He has also been awarded honorary doctorates from 14 universities worldwide. His talk tonight is entitled The Health Gap: Why It Concerns All of Us and What to Do About It. Please hold questions to the end, and join me in welcoming Michael to the podium.
Thank you, and what a pleasure to address this august gathering about something that I think should concern all of us. As perhaps you know, I published a book on the subject, available, I hope, from all good bookstores.
We have a little problem. Keep talking.
Okay, do with that. Let me start by reading from chapter 4. Anybody can start with chapter 1. In Aldous Huxley's dystopia, Brave New World, there were 5 castes. The alphas and betas were allowed to develop normally. The gammas, deltas, and epsilons were treated with chemicals to arrest their development, intellectually and physically. The result? A neatly stratified society with intellectual function and physical development correlated with caste. That was a satire, wasn't it? No relation with real life. We would never, surely, tolerate a state of affairs that stratified people, then made it harder for the lower orders, but helped the higher orders to reach their full potential. Were we to find a chemical in the water or in food that was damaging children's growth and their brains worldwide, and thus their intellectual development and control of emotions, we would clamour for immediate action. Remove the chemical and allow all our children to flourish. Stop the injustice now. Yet, unwittingly perhaps, we do tolerate such a state of affairs. The pollutant is poverty, or more generally, social disadvantage, lower rank in the social hierarchy, and it limits children's intellectual and social development. We should want that removed as if it were any other toxin. Should we not? This is what the evidence looks like. From a birth cohort study in Britain, the Millennium Birth Cohort, where families were classified from richest to poorest. This is social and emotional difficulties at age 3 and at age 5. A social gradient. I could show you cognitive development, physical development, as well as difficulties, social and emotional and behavioral development, and there's a gradient. Do we think this is inevitable? Well, on this slide, just as an introduction, on this slide represents an analysis. We asked parents in this study, is it important to speak to a child aged 3? About 20% of parents denied that it was important to speak to a child aged 3. We asked, is it important to cuddle a child aged 3? About 20% of parents deny it's important to cuddle a child aged 3. Is there an experience on this world more rewarding than cuddling a 3-year-old child? And yet, a fifth of parents deny that that's important. And it follows the social gradient. The lower in the social hierarchy, the more likely are parents to deny it's important to speak, cuddle, play, do music. And that accounts for about half of the social gradient in social and emotional difficulties. I'll go into this more as I go on. But it's a prima facie case that that social gradient is not inevitable. We could remove the toxin, which is social disadvantage. And why is this important to the health gap? Because what begins at the beginning of life, the inequity in early child development, determines what happens when children get to school, which in turn determines whether they go on to further education, what sort of qualifications they get, which has a big impact on income, kind of job you do, where you live. And all of those have an impact on health. And it starts at the beginning of life. I said, stop the injustice now. I did ask myself what I meant by that. We use the term in Britain, fair society. Europeans, non-British Europeans, tell me that fairness sounds like the English playing cricket. They don't, it's a very British concept, fairness. But I think a key indicator of a fair society is a fair distribution of health. And by that I mean, if inequalities, you don't use the word inequalities in the US, you talk about disparities, it's a bit blander. But if the inequalities in health between social groups are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means and are not avoided, that's unfair, inequitable. So a fair society, I would argue, can be judged by the fair distribution of health. These avoidable health inequalities. Now, there's not a politician who would say in public, that they were against equality of opportunity. Everybody, could you imagine if a US politician says, I think the children in Delaware should be stopped from developing in favor of the children from Tennessee? He may think that, but he's not going to say it. All politicians are in favor of equality of opportunity. The problem is the playing field is tilted. If you don't know what this means, try and find a tame economist in the room and ask them what it means. But if there are no tame, actually that's an oxymoron, isn't it? A tame economist, untamable. I'll explain what it means. This is the correlation between the income of parents and the income of their adult children. And it's for countries. So if the income of parents and income of adult children exactly resembles each other, rich parents have rich children, poor parents have poor children, middle parents have middle children, a country would score 1 on this index. And you can see that the US and the UK score very highly. This ought to come as a shock to you. You think that the UK's got this solidified caste system we call class, and that once you're in one of them, you can't get into any other one. Your social mobility is about as bad as ours. Now, if there were no correlation between income of parents and income of adult children, a country would score 0. So Denmark, Norway, Finland have low scores on this index. A high degree of social mobility. Who your parents were does not have a strong determining impact on your own income. The problem is that's correlated with the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient, as I hope you know, is a measure of income inequality. A high Gini means more income inequality. So the greater the income inequality, the less social mobility. In other words, the greater the distance between the rungs of the ladder, the more difficult it is to get from one rung to the next. Where income inequality is large, as it is in this country, and not quite to the same extent, but as it is in the UK, where income inequality is large, we do not have equality of opportunity. The playing field is tilted so that those politicians who say they all believe in equality of opportunity don't believe in creating the conditions that might lead to genuine equality of opportunity. Now, I can't resist, because I know it's a misnomer, but because it is the Philosophical Society of Washington, I can't resist just a wee bit of philosophy. Well, on this issue of what is a fair society. I was having a discussion with an economist, in fact, one that actually won the Nobel Prize for economics, and I drew these 2 graphs. If we say this is mortality rate, high social, that's low should be there, I don't know why that happened. High social position, low social position. So there's a graded relation between social position and mortality. The lower the social position, the higher the mortality. And then I drew a second graph that looks at social position and mortality. And in the second one, you can see that everyone's mortality, each social group, thanks. Thank you. Each social group, I probably violated some 120-year-old rule by taking my jacket off, but the president was kind. And the economist I was talking to said, which of these two curves would you prefer? Because under the blue one, everyone's mortality is lower, but the improvement was greater the better off you were to begin with. So the inequality is steeper, whether we measure it as relative or absolute inequality. A philosopher at Harvard called this Marmot's dilemma. But so this economist said, which of these two would you prefer? And I said, neither. He said, you have to choose. Why? Because you're bigger than me? He said, well, I can tell you, all economists would choose the blue one. I said, do you not care about inequality? No, not much. Because a good utilitarian, I work at UCL, and Jeremy Bentham's auto icon is outside the president's office. Wave at Jeremy when I go in to see the president. Founder of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. He didn't care about distributions. So the blue one's better than the red one. Let's go home. Job done. But I care about inequality. And in fact, if you were a Rawlsian philosopher, you would say not only is the blue one preferable, but it's fairer under Rawls' difference principle, because anything that improves the conditions of the worst off is fairer than the other. Now I'm really in trouble. I got the utilitarians telling me, forget about inequality. One said to me, what are you, some sort of egalitarian? Go home and get over it. And then the Rawlsians telling me the blue one's fairer than the red one. Fairer, but they're bigger inequalities. Equality does not mean justice. This is equality, this is justice. I think we have to create the conditions for people to lead flourishing lives. We don't simply say, here's the playing field, get on with it. I think we have a responsibility to take the actions that give everybody the opportunity to lead a flourishing life. Or in terms that Amartya Sen describes it, people should have the freedom to lead lives they have reason to value. So the idea of freedom has been hijacked by libertarians. We should all be privileging freedom. The libertarians say that any state involvement is abolishing people's freedom. And I take a very different view. That's not abolishing people's freedom. That's giving them the opportunity to have a flourishing life and to create the conditions for people to have lives that they have reason to value. I was lecturing in the US earlier this year, and I was about to give my lecture on health inequalities when Baltimore erupted. And I couldn't start to talk about what I had to talk about without talking about Baltimore, because I'd written about Baltimore in my book. And then it erupted. Well, you'll remember that the precipitant of that eruption in Baltimore was the killing of a black man in police custody, or should I say one more killing of a black man by police. But the underlying cause was inequality. When I say Baltimore erupted, it wasn't Baltimore that erupted. It was the Upton Druid area of Baltimore, Upton Druid Heights. And I'll talk about these two characters, Shaun and Bobby. Bobby grew up in Greater Roland Park, in Poplar. And the life expectancy in Upton Druid is 63. In Roland Park, it's 83. When we had urban riots in London in the summer of 2011, they were precipitated by the killing of a black man by the police. What sick joke is that played on humanity? But they broke out in Tottenham. And I'd been showing figures that Tottenham had the lowest male life expectancy in London, 20 years shorter than the best. And the riots broke out in the area with the shortest life expectancy, just like in Baltimore. I don't think urban riots cause ill health. Well, not directly. And I don't think ill health causes urban riots. But I think inequality of social conditions leads both to urban unrest and to ill health. And if we look at these two characters, Shaun and Bobby, in Upton Druid, half the families were single-parent families. Median household income in 2010 was $17,000. 4 out of 10 were under proficient reading in the 3rd grade. More than 50% missed at least 20 days of high school. 90% did not go on to college. Whoops. In Roland Park, 93% were 2-parent families, as distinct from half being 1 parent. Median income, $90,000. As against 17,000, 97% achieved proficient or advanced in the 3rd grade in reading. Only 8% missed 20 days. 75% completed college, as against 90% who did not go on to college. In Upton Druid, each year, a third, aged 10 to 17, are arrested for juvenile disorder. 1/3 each year. The possibility that a youngster will get to age 17 without having been arrested is quite small. And you know what that means for the rest of his life. Difficulty with employment, not being able to vote, not being part of society. He has the freedom to lead a flourishing life. Could you imagine if you went into one of those 17-year-old youngsters' classes and you say, you know, you really shouldn't smoke. But you might get lung cancer when you're 59. And watch the amount of saturated fat and salt in your diet. This is a polite society, so I won't say in graphic terms what he's likely to say to you. But he might say, could you please leave? Or words to that effect. And we think that people should take responsibility for their own health, don't we? It's their own fault if they're if they're unhealthy. And there were 100 non-fatal shootings for every 10,000 residents, and nearly 40 fatal shootings per 10,000. In Roland Park, the youngsters stay out of the clutches, both of the gangs and the police. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. And no non-fatal shootings and 4 homicides per 10,000. Dramatic differences. You may have seen this. It was widely reported in the US. Anne Case and Angus Deaton, looking at mortality in men aged 45 to 54 for US non-Hispanic whites. There's the mortality, and it went up. France, Germany, US Hispanics, UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden, going down, except for the US non-Hispanic whites. And what did these people die of? Why was the mortality going up? They died of poisonings related to alcohol and drugs, of suicide, of chronic liver disease related to alcohol, and external cause of death, violent deaths apart from suicide. And from a previous paper, there was a gradient, a graded relation between education and life expectancy. It was not only that the poor were doing poorly, but the more years of education, white women, black women, white men, black men, the more years of education, the longer the life expectancy, the lower the mortality. And this is important because I often get asked, well, does this apply to me? I'm not poor. I mean, think of your attitudes to the poor. If you were of one political persuasion, as I've already hinted, you might think the poor are architects of their own misfortune. They behave badly, they could have gone to college and got a good job, but they didn't. They were rascals. And so they've only got themselves to blame. Or if you're of a different political persuasion, he said moving left, of a different political persuasion, you might say poverty is a stain on a civilized society. And we're all responsible for those who are in poverty. But whether you're of that persuasion, you think the poor are to blame or we are to blame for the poor, either way, you think, that's not me. I'm not poor. I may not be the richest, but I'm not the poorest, so this has got nothing to do with me. Well, that's untrue. It's got a lot to do with you. Go into, let's say you're a 15-year-old boy. Looking at the white hairs here, that seems unlikely, I know. But say you're a 15-year-old boy and go into an American school and count 100 boys just like you. 13 of you will fail to reach your 60th birthday. Is 13 a lot? Well, it's double the Swedish figure. It's higher than in Costa Rica, Chile, Cuba, most European countries. It's the same as Georgia. I don't mean Georgia, I mean Georgia, Tbilisi, not Atlanta. It's this. In fact, there are 194 member states of the World Health Organization, and 49 rank higher on this measure, better, than does the US. You rank 50th. What? 17% of your budget goes on health care? Health care is irrelevant to this story. I'm overstating it. But this is not about health care. These youngsters are dying of the things I mentioned, of poisonings and suicide and chronic liver disease due to alcohol, not due to lack of treatment, but to too much booze, and to external causes of death. Guns. They kill people. They're very bad for the public health. I'm not sure if that was approval or disapproval of what I said. Or horrified that I even dared mention guns, it's part of the American psyche to bear firearms. Most of us from other countries think it's not actually very good for the public health to have a lot of guns around. My message is that this story affects everybody. And it affects everybody, and I'll show you the British version of those data by education, because there's a social gradient in health. This is looking at Britain. Each dot here represents a neighborhood. And the neighborhoods are classified by income deprivation. The most deprived there, the least deprived here. And the top graph is life expectancy. And what you can see, this is figure 1 from my book, which you can buy at good bookshops or online from some online thing that I won't mention. But it's a river in Brazil. And people near the top have shorter life expectancy than those at the top. People in the middle have shorter life expectancy than those near the top. It's a gradient that runs all the way from top to bottom. Now, this is disability-free life expectancy. It's an even steeper gradient. The difference between the 5th centile and the 95th centile is 17 years, which means on average, people roughly in the middle have 8 fewer years of healthy life. 8 fewer years of healthy life means earlier onset of declining grip strength, of difficulty walking, of declining cognitive function, and of course, shorter life. That means we're all involved and the whole of society is involved. The poor the most, but everybody. I calculated in Britain, if everybody had the low mortality of the top 10%, there would be 200,000 fewer deaths each year. That means in the US, there'd be 1 million fewer deaths each year due to inequality. In Britain, that comes out as 500 a day. So in the US, it would be 2,500 a day. Is this worth focusing on? Well, what else would be more worth focusing on? And these gradients, we see them everywhere. Under 5 mortality by wealth quintile in different countries. It's been put to me by very distinguished people involved in global health. Well, really the problem is the bottom 10%, isn't it? And my answer is no, it isn't. If you were in the middle quintile in India, you'd want your children to have an under 5 mortality as low as the top quintile. You wouldn't say, well, I'm not in the bottom 10%, forget me. You'd want everybody to have a mortality as low as the top 20%. And if you're in the top quintile in India, you'd want to have an under 5 mortality as low as the bottom quintile in Peru. And if you're in the top quintile in Peru, you'd want to have an under 5 mortality as low as Iceland, which is 2 per 1,000 live births, not 15. The gradient means we've got to flatten the slope, reduce inequalities, not only deal with poverty, and improve things for everybody. And it's not just about money. This is income per person for countries adjusting for purchasing power. So it's gross domestic product adjusting for purchasing power, and life expectancy. At low levels of income, a small increase in income is associated with a big increase in life expectancy. As a country, if you've got no money, a little bit of money makes a difference. It may make the difference between starvation and non-starvation, between being able to pipe clean water in or not being able to pipe clean water. And it does for a family too. If you're a family in a rich country and you have no money, a little bit of money makes a difference. You can feed your children. But when we get up for countries to about $10,000 at purchasing power parities, national income, Costa Rica, Cuba, Mexico, Chile, and go all the way out to Luxembourg with its ill-gotten gains, there's no relation with life expectancy. Getting richer doesn't make a country healthier once it's above that threshold, that inflection point. Social conditions are crucial, but it's not just income. And in trying to figure out what to do, I chaired, as you heard, the WHO, World Health Organization Commission on Social Determinants of Health. We called our report Closing the Gap in a Generation. And then the so-called Marmot review in England, where we were trying to apply the findings of the WHO Commission, a European review of social determinants and the health divide. And today, literally today, morning and afternoon, before I came to the lovely Cosmos Club, I was with the Pan American Health Organization. We're planning the review we're going to do of social determinants and health inequities in the Americas. And much of the learning from these commissions found its way into the health gap, which is why I wrote the book, to try and take what's in relatively technical commission reports and put it in what I hope is a more accessible form. So the question is, what can we do about the social gradient in health, the health inequalities within and between countries? Well, we start at the beginning of life and take a life course approach. So let's start with give every child the best start in life. I talked about Baltimore. When we published the report of the Global Commission, I drew attention to the fact that in Glasgow, in the Scottish city of Glasgow, in Calton, a district of Glasgow, life expectancy for men was 54. And in Lenzie, it was 82. A 28-year gap in life expectancy in two districts 11 kilometers apart. 54, 82. I was at a meeting in Brussels and a Scottish professor came up to me and said, I live in Lenzie, the rich bit, and I drink in the pub regularly with a friend from Calton. And the other night I was chatting to my friend and it turned out he'd made no arrangements for Social Security, pension. And I said to my friend, why not? And he said, because I'm 54. Oh my God. I mean, I'm delighted my research gets discussed in Scottish pubs, but and elsewhere, I hope. But the idea that he took these figures as a death knell, and that then determined, well, he didn't need to do anything, because it's like the chap who, on his 100th birthday, was asked how he felt, and he said, if I'd known I was going to live this long, I would have looked after myself. So Jimmy is based on a case study brought to me by Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of homicide in Glasgow. He, born to a single mother who had a succession of partners, each of whom abused Jimmy physically, if not sexually. They moved house every year or 18 months. By the time he got to school, he was labeled as having behavioral problems. As soon as he was old enough, he was labeled as a delinquent. He had spells in prison. Like more than 60% of young men in prison, he had 2 or more diagnoses of psychiatric illness, 14 times the frequency of the general population. We don't lock them up unless we think they're crazy. For young women, the frequency among prisoners is 30 times the frequency of in the general population. He'd never had a proper job. Any money he gets goes on drink and drugs. His diet, if you could call it that, as pub food, fast food, and alcohol. There were questions about violent behavior, and his girlfriends would toss him out. And his life expectancy is 8 years shorter than the Indian average. And what does Jimmy die of? Poisonings due to drugs and alcohol, suicide, chronic liver disease related to alcohol, and external causes of death. The same causes of death that we talked about with the non-Hispanic whites, the rise in mortality in the US. This starts at the beginning of life, and it's a tragedy. And as I said in talking about Baltimore, if you think Jimmy's somehow responsible for his ill health and he should take personal responsibility, are you going to ignore the imprint on him of his tragic life history? I would say if we're going to have an approach that emphasizes personal responsibility, give Jimmy a stable background, let him have a good education, graduate from high school, have the opportunity to go on to university, and then if he chooses to sit under the Glasgow equivalent of the Yum Yum tree, that's up to Jimmy. That's his choice. But he's not free to choose given this tragic life history. And it starts at the beginning of life, and we have a good deal of understanding as to what's going on. Look at this. It comes from the 1970 British birth cohort. It's looking at cognitive development, IQ in another name. Cognitive development. Children who at 22 months of age, and they're followed to 10 years, children who at 22 months of age, if they were in the 10th centile of cognitive development, and they grew up in families of low socioeconomic status, they remain low. There's regression to the mean, but that needn't detain us. If they grow up in families of high socioeconomic status, they catch up. Now look at the children who at 22 months of age were in the 90th centile, so high performers. If they grow up in families of high socioeconomic status, they remain high. If they grow up in families of low socioeconomic status, assume for the moment that all the differences at 22 months are biologically determined, genes, birth trauma, and the like. And the differences associated with the socioeconomic status of the family are social. The social trumps the biological. Now, not all the differences at 22 months are biological. The quality of early rearing, early nutrition really matter. This is why I began by saying this is an injustice, because it is potentially reversible. The Jimmies of the world are condemned to not achieve their full potential. But it's a gradient. It's not just the Jimmies, it's the ones in the middle who are not doing as well as they might if conditions were better. It's a gradient. Even the ones near the top could probably do better. And we've been monitoring early child development, and you can see the gradient. This is the percent of children who achieve a good level of development age 5 in each local authority in England. And they're ranked based on an index of multiple deprivation. So the more affluent up here, the less affluent, the more deprived down there. And you can see the gradient. But you can see something else. There's a good deal of scatter around the line. Aha! That suggests two strategies. One is reduce deprivation. Have these people live in better social and economic conditions, and their children are more likely to flourish. Bring them up towards the middle. But for a given level of deprivation, some areas are doing better than others. Aha! We can break the link, figure out what's going on in the ones that are doing better and apply it. And again, we have a good deal of knowledge of what is going on. But there's one other thing about this, and that is the median was at 59%. What that means is, on average, only 59% of children in England were classified as having a good level of development age 5, as being ready for school. What? In a brainy country like England? Can't quite remember what we've done, but I'm sure we've done some good things. Shakespeare. In a brainy country like England, only 59% of children are classified as being ready for school. Must be something wrong with our counting. Well, when we look at UNICEF figures, their scorecard, country comparisons on average rank in 4 dimensions: child well-being, material, health, education, and behaviors and risks. Oh my God. There we are, down the bottom in the early 2000s. Whoops. We've gone zooming up to 16th. I do like lecturing in the US. It's the only big country that makes me feel halfway decent about my own. This is dreadful. The implication of the gradient is we're failing our children on a grand scale, right across the board. The degree of failure is related to the degree of deprivation. The more deprived, the worse the failure. But in the middle, we're doing badly. No wonder we're not doing well in health, you and us. And it starts at the beginning of life. And here are some of the things that are related to it. This is reading scores and maths scores at age 7. And the more risk factors present, the lower the scores. And the risk factors are low birth weight, not being breastfed, maternal depression, lone parent, low income, unemployment, low maternal qualifications, damp housing, social housing, and area deprivation. And we know. I'm sorry?
What are the maternal qualifications?
Lack of maternal, not having a degree. Not having a degree, going to university, getting a bachelor's degree or the like. So that's what we mean by lack of qualifications, academic qualifications. And we know that good services can make a difference. That services to support families and early child development. And we also know that policy can reduce poverty. This is child poverty rates before and after taxes and transfers. So look at Latvia. Before fiscal policy, taxes and transfers, child poverty is defined as less than 60% of median income. So it's a relative measure. Before taxes and transfers, child poverty in Latvia was 35%. In Sweden, it was 32%. After taxes and transfers, child poverty in Latvia was still 25%. In Sweden, it was 12%. In Slovenia, it's even lower. In Sweden, they've decided they're intolerant of child poverty. So they use the fiscal system, the Minister of Finance, to have appropriate redistribution through the tax and social spending system. The UK, we look more like Latvia than we do like Sweden. And I know the question on your very lips right now is, how does the US look? Worse than Latvia. Worse than Latvia. You've decided that you're quite tolerant of high levels of child poverty. So you won't use the levers that are available to reduce child poverty. You live in a democracy. That must be the level of child poverty that you want. Otherwise, you'd organize a government that did something different. So congratulations. That could just possibly be linked to the fact that your 15-year-old's chance of survival to age 60 is worse than in 49 other countries. Do we know what to do? We do. We may not know how to get there, but this isn't ignorance. The evidence, the scientific evidence, is pretty strong. And I talked about the importance of services to help children develop. One type of service is enrolling children in preschool. This is the percent of children aged 3 to 5 enrolled in preschool in different Latin American countries. There's Cuba, Costa Rica, Chile. More than 90% of children are enrolled in preschool. Paraguay, Dominican Republic, Colombia, much lower proportions. And then the dotted line is children getting above a certain grade of reading in the 6th grade. So the more enrolled in preschool, the better the performance in reading. It turns out the best life expectancy in these countries is Cuba, Costa Rica, and Chile, and the worst is Paraguay, Dominican Republic, and Colombia. It's not causation, it's not proved, but it's consistent with saying good early child development and services make a difference, good performance in schools, better health in adulthood. So schools really matter, maximizing capabilities and control. Education. Look at total fertility rate, births per woman, by education. In Bangladesh, no education, primary or secondary or higher. India, 2.1 births per woman. In those with secondary or higher. Ethiopia, 2. If you think that low-income countries would do better with fewer children, educate women. Best possible intervention. Because they'll have fewer babies. The babies they have are more likely to survive. Lower infant mortality with maternal education. And look at this. The proportion of women agreeing that it is acceptable for a husband to beat his wife if she refused to have sex with him. In Mali, 3/4 of women with no education endorsed that proposition. But it does go down with education. Now, when you get involved in global health, the number one lesson is be culturally sensitive. They do things differently in other countries. Surely, human rights here should trump cultural sensitivity. The right of a woman to have control over her sexuality and her body and to be treated like a human being trumps cultural sensitivity. And we know that because the more educated the woman, the less likely she is to endorse this ghastly proposition. Education makes a big difference. One of the issues is that if I'm trying to link the social gradient in health with social and economic differences in society and differences in education, all societies have social hierarchies, and if health follows the social hierarchy, then maybe we're sunk. All societies will have inequalities in health. Well, they do, but the magnitude varies. This is life expectancy at 50 in 15 European countries, classified by education. These are the males. ISC ED 0 to 2 is primary education, international social classification education, and 5 to 6 is university, tertiary education. So there's Sweden, SE, has the longest life expectancy at 50, and a narrow gap between those with university education and those with primary education. There's Hungary, Estonia, Bulgaria, low average, and a huge difference. I imagined it, and I write about this in the book, that I say, imagine you were a parent in Hungary and you say to your child, you should do your homework. And the child says, I want to gladden my heart and nourish my soul. I'm a child. I want to look at the blue sky and sniff the flowers. And you say, do your homework, work hard at school, and you can go to university. And the child says, I'm a child, for heaven's sake. Why do I care about going to university? I want to do what children do. You're starting to regret that you began this conversation. So you say to the child, no, it's not just the going to university for its own sake, but if you go to university, you'll have a better life and a longer, healthier life. And the child says, well, if that's so important, why didn't you arrange for me to be born in Sweden rather than Hungary? And you say, be quiet and eat your vegetables. And the child says, pulling rank is the last refuge of a scoundrel. I want to know, says the child, why learning irregular verbs is going to make a bigger difference to my health in Hungary than it is in Sweden. You're deeply regretting you began this conversation with your child. So you say, a good point, well made. Education has two kinds of function. One is, always and everywhere, more education gives you better skills. Your mind is better developed. You can cope with complex society better. You can figure your way through society. So always and everywhere, training the brain is a good recipe for having a better life. But there's something else. More education, as I said a bit earlier this evening, more education gets you a better job, more income, better living conditions, and that gets you better health. So it's both. In those countries, Norway, for example, I was in Oslo, and an official from the Ministry of Health came to my hotel for a meeting. And instead of sitting for a coffee, we decided to go for a walk. And she said, do you want to walk up the gradient or down the gradient? I said, down. So we walked east. It's always in European cities, the deprived part's always to the east. So we walked east. And we walked for a bit, and she said, we're there. I said, where are we? She said, this is the most deprived part of Oslo. You're kidding me. This is slums done by the Swiss. I expected to see flowers coming out of window boxes. I said, you call this deprivation? You guys are amateurs. Come to the UK, I'll show you deprivation. Well, if that's the best they can do in terms of deprivation, it's not such a surprise that there might be a relatively narrow gap in health. And the other way of looking at this is that the between-country difference is much smaller for those with university education than it is for those with primary education. They know how to get good health in Hungary and Estonia and Bulgaria and Romania. They get it for people with university education. It's just not so good They have no education in those countries. So, early child development, education, employment, and work. We want work to do a lot of things. One way we've been looking at work is 2 measures of stress at work. Imbalance between effort and reward. Evidence shows that jobs characterized by high effort and low reward increase risk of heart disease, of mental illness, and of sickness absence. And what we see here is the lower the occupational class, the greater the frequency of jobs characterized by imbalance between effort and reward. And low control at work, the lower the class, the greater the frequency of low control. So that's one of the mechanisms explaining the social gradient in health, these psychosocial working conditions. The other thing we'd like work to do is to get people out of poverty, both in this country and in Britain. We think, who was it? Was it President Reagan who coined the term welfare queen? We think that people are living the life of Riley on benefits, and if we made the benefits less beneficial, then they'd go into work and then they wouldn't be in poverty anymore. Well, regrettably, neither part of that proposition is true. This is below the minimum income threshold in the UK, trends over time, and in the latest figures, there are more families below the minimum income threshold where at least one adult is working than in workless households. The working households, workless households. Work is not a way out of poverty. The reason these people are in poverty is not because they're not trying hard enough, it's because they're lowly paid. They're working, but they're in low-paid jobs. They're not paid enough to live on. These are US figures from the OECD back in 2008, looking at deciles of income, and it's real earnings growth for men and women working full-time. So this is full-time work by decile. And from 1980 to 2005, the bottom 5 deciles, the bottom half of the distribution for men, had a decline. This is working full-time, had a decline in income. And bringing this further up to date, this is average real wage index. So these are employed people, not unemployed people, where 2007 is 100. There's the US, virtually no change from 2007. We're told by our politicians we're the envy of the rich world. We've got the best performing economy and we should be really pleased. And heavens, look how far we are below the 2007 level. So the average is doing really badly. As you know, I'm sure, in the US, 2011-12, for every dollar of economic growth, 91 cents went to the top 1%. So this was not very reasonably distributed. And if we look globally, somebody wrote a book called The World is Flat. This is income distribution. Poorer countries, richer countries, and within the countries, poorer classes, richer classes. Look how flat the world is now in terms of income. It's quite remarkable how flat it is. And we think enjoying a healthy standard of living is important. This will come as shocking news. The more generous a country's social expenditure on social protection, welfare, the better the health. This is the percent of the population reporting poor health. The more miserly the country's expenditure, the higher the proportion in poor health in general. The more generous, the fewer people in poor health. And similarly, we see a social gradient. Low education, primary education, secondary and tertiary, and that gradient gets narrower the more a country spends socially. Spending on social welfare is quite a good expenditure. The UK is relatively miserly, the US is relatively miserly, and that's again part of the reason we're not doing so well in terms of health. Healthy and sustainable places and communities. Where national governments are unwilling or unable to take this agenda on board, local governments can make a huge difference. In Britain, the King's Fund did a survey of 65 local governments, 65 local areas, and asked them what their priorities were for health and well-being. 49 of the 65 said Marmot principles. That's me, by the way. That, in other words, they'd taken my English review and they said this was their blueprint for local government policy to improve health and well-being. Sweden took on board the whole idea of a socially sustainable Malmo at the city level. Let me finish by saying that I'd wanted to call this book The Organization of Misery. And the publisher said, you can't do that. You can't call a book The Organization of Misery. Well, I'd been quoting Pablo Neruda. Rise up with me against the organization of misery. So I wanted people to rise up against the organization of misery. And the publisher said, "Niet." So I said, well, can I call it the Organization of Hope? He said, well, it's a bit better, but nobody will have a clue what you're talking about. So I called it the Health Gap. But I called the first chapter the Organization of Misery because I lay out how organized misery is in terms of ill health. It follows social gradients, social exclusion. It really is very organized. It's non-random. But I call the last chapter the Organization of Hope because I'm inspired by examples from around the world where we can make a difference. And let me show you just one. This is the social gradient in stunting in Brazil. 1974-5, so it's the proportion of children with low growth in the first year of life by family income quintiles, 74-75, 89, 96. Wow. It's nearly flat. That's not bad. 30 years, and they nearly abolished the social gradient. That's why I talk about the Organization of Hope. We can do it. We've got the evidence, and we've got good examples where people are acting on the evidence and making a difference. When I did the European review, the European region of WHO sportingly includes Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and some other stan, because it's the whole of the former Soviet Union. And some countries are doing very little on this social determinants agenda. And we said, if you're doing very little, do something. It'll make a difference. If you're doing a bit, if you're Poland, Czech Republic, do more. And if you're Sweden, do it better. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. There is a procedure. There are a couple of people with microphones. If you keep your hand up, they'll bring the microphone to you. When you get it, please stand up, tell us your name. If you're a member, you're not. No penalty for not being a member. And ask a question. Please refrain from making speeches. You can do that in the social hour.
Hello, I'm David Rosen, lifetime member. What about those countries in Africa, like South Africa and Rwanda, where there's been there's been a lot of changes with social inequality? Is everybody that much better off, top to bottom, as you're implying? You seem to have left out a lot of countries.
Well, I don't think there are other people have written on the topic suggesting that there's a kind of necessary mechanical relation between the degree of income inequality and health. And there isn't. It's not a mechanical relationship. And I don't say that in my book.
It's not income, but you showed lots of graphs on income.
I do.
Equality. You showed a lot of them and make these.
Well, what I say in the book, and I quote Amartya Sen, who I mentioned earlier, that relative inequality with respect to income translates into absolute inequality with respect to capabilities. In other words, it's not just what you have, but what you can do with what you have. And the inequalities in South Africa are still extreme in terms of what you can do with what you have. You go to streets in Johannesburg, and you really wouldn't want to be at one end of the street compared with the other end of the street, because the extremes, and it's not just income, it's living conditions, it's all the things that I talk about, which they are extremely different. And it's not just income.
My name is Griffin, James Griffin. I'm a member. I'm curious about the English-speaking culture and history, which we share with Britain, and our low score. Do you have any ideas about how that might have set us apart, say, from Germany and France?
I don't quite know how it set us apart, but I can say we are different. And for example, I was lecturing in Britain a couple of days ago, and a Swedish member of the audience who'd lived in Britain, it turned out, for a dozen years, a doctor. I was talking to the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, and he said, in Sweden, it's really different. The reason our governments behave differently is because the people's attitudes are different. The reason, he wasn't talking about the US, he was talking about the UK, is that people tolerate these relatively stingy expenditures on children's services, on preschool education, we had Sure Start children's centers, on the fact that families with children, for example, and it's not just income, but income's not irrelevant. We took some visitors out to East London. So East is the deprived part of London. And in a very poor part of London, there was childcare offered by the local authority, and it cost £850 a month. Now, for a woman, it's usually a woman, to go out to work and earn enough to pay for the childcare in that poor part of London, it's wholly unlikely that she could find a job that would pay enough to cover the childcare. A Swedish member of the group said, in Sweden, you'd pay £100, not £850, because it's subsidized by the local community. And that means both parents can choose to go out to work, so there are fewer children in poverty. So they use their resources differently. And that's part of a commitment to a fairer distribution of resources, of not wanting to see people doing without, of not blaming people for not being able to afford to go out to work because they couldn't pay for the childcare. it's somehow a commitment to a whole of society. Now they are very concerned. Malmö is a migrant city. Gothenburg in Sweden, 37% of the population of Gothenburg are either the migrants or the children of migrants. And they've got a major challenge in society to try and bring new entrants to the country into their Swedish outlook, into their way of approaching social issues. And it's not just money. Money's not irrelevant, but it's a philosophy of social inclusion, of not letting people behind, of universalism, of gender equity. And these are all key. I can't answer your question of why the US and the UK don't seem to share that. We did share it more post-World War II, when we established the National Health Service, Beveridge and the welfare state. We established the welfare state, and governments of the right and the left both shared. But the window of what's acceptable has moved to the right. Now, things that used to be mainstream are considered Marxist. You know, the leader of the Labour Party now, I don't have a great deal of regard for him, so that's by the by, but he says things that a generation ago were just mainstream, centre, and he's now being labelled as a Stalin. It's ridiculous. So the window of what's acceptable discussion has moved so far to the right that anybody outside that window is seen as a dangerous radical. Why that's happened, whether it's the media, Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, I don't know what's going on, but I know it's happening.
Tim?
Timothy Thomas, I'm a member of the society. I'm puzzled as to what advantage I have with my PhD as I approach life compared to those without. And I'm sitting in front of the Department of Motor Vehicles website. I'm trying to get my tags up, and it is not easy. And I am using all my intellectual facilities, and I cannot find it. I'm trying this, I'm trying that, I'm trying the other. Then I get to my taxes. I want to maximize the amount I keep. So it's not easy. You have really got to work hard. You go to the grocery store, you want to get the best deal on your cereal. It's not easy. None of it is arranged for the uneducated. All of it is arranged for the highly educated. So the society at large is, why don't they test it on the uneducated? And then I'll be able to follow it too. Right. So, but it seems to me it's like we figured out a way to keep the poor poor by making it unable for them to get a good deal in the grocery store, get a good deal on their taxes, or get a good deal at the DMV.
Well, I think that's a very insightful comment. There are two MIT economists, Banerjee and Duflo, who wrote a book called Poor Economics. And part of the point they make is that the poor have to do too much work, that you and I turn on the tap and we can drink the water. If you're living in a poor country, you can't do that. You've got to boil it or get purification, or you probably don't have a tap. You've got to get it from a river, and you've got to do so much work to get a glass of water. And it's very easy. And you've just eloquently described how difficult with a PhD it is to negotiate some of this. And as you say, think how hard that is without your abilities. So we make life really hard for the poor. We make them do so much more work. Think how hard it is to balance a budget. Most of us in this room don't spend a lot of time balancing a budget. We don't do it daily or weekly. But if you're really at the bottom end, you're really doing it daily, if not weekly. And even in the middle, and that's the gradient idea, that it's a lot easier than if you're at the bottom, but it's not as easy at the top. Now, there's a Swedish researcher, probably most famous social scientist in Sweden, Robert Eriksson, who looked at life expectancy based on the Swedish census and found that people with a PhD had the lowest mortality, lower than people with professional degrees, even though the ones with professional degrees were richer because they were getting more income. And he thinks that people with PhDs have more control over their lives. They actually have more interesting lives. And they're doing more. I mean, most people in this room are presumably scientists. They're doing things that more closely relate to what they want to do. They go to work because they're driven to go to work. I mean, it's terrific. The worst thing that could happen to most of us is to be deprived of the privilege of doing the work we do. That's not true. And it's increasingly not true the lower you are in the hierarchy. So that's his idea.
We have a question in the back and then one here. And
Jeff
then-
Cavaservice, not a member. I had a question about a slide that was about 20 from the end of the deck.
Oh, that one, yeah.
Yeah, that one. It's about the anticipated extra years of mortality after age 50. What do you say to your precocious 6-year-old son who says, never mind what country I was born into, why did I have the misfortune of not being born a woman?
Sorry, the misfortune of?
Not being born a woman.
Yep. Well, that's true. That's true in Europe. It's not true in other parts of the world, of course.
True in the US,
and that's part of the avoidable, that's part of the inequity. And we know that under best social conditions, women will survive longer than men, no question. So where women are not surviving longer than men, we know we've got less than optimal social conditions.
My name is Charles Rong. I'm not the member. First of all, thank you for your insightful presentation. And the question is, you show a plot with United States and the UK together with a higher correlation. And then Finland and Sweden at the other end with a lower correlation. The UK was the world superpower in the past. And today, the United States is the world superpower. I wonder, in your opinion, maybe in the 21st century, at some time, a group of the country like Finland, Sweden, and Norway, they can become the world superpower for the next.
I thought you were going to say China is going to become the superpower because of its big growth of inequality, which has grown enormously in China, as you know. Somehow it seems slightly unlikely to me that 4 million Finns are going to rule the world. I suspect it seems unlikely to the 4 million Finns as well. But it is a very harmonious society. And they have a magnificent education system. They get the best scores in Europe, not as good as Macau in China, but the best scores on educational performance in Europe, with the greatest degree of equity in education. So it is a harmonious society, and I think that relates to the comparatively low inequality and the high social mobility.
So that means those countries represent the best model of current human civilization.
I would say that European countries, certain European countries, excluding my own, at the end of the 20th century, no question, that represented the best opportunities to lead flourishing lives, which I measure by health and health equity, in history. I think that the global financial crisis was a challenge. Now, as it turned out, the Nordic countries survived that relatively unscathed. So they continued this rather important achievement that we saw in the last quarter of the 20th century. I think there's no question. I mean, I went to Robert Fogel, who was a famous Chicago economist, 80th birthday party in Chicago. I was the only non-economist in the room. And one economist got up and he said, as if it didn't need to be discussed, all the things the Europeans were doing wrong. And I've been brooding ever since. You know, with economists, you can't get a word in edgewise. And I said, just remind me again what they're doing wrong. Longer life expectancy, lower crime rates, work fewer hours, fewer socially excluded people, public systems that work, greater degrees of gender equity, more social mobility. Just remind me again what they were doing wrong.
The next question back here, and then Dale.
Jennifer Wiseman, newly elected to membership this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm going to get myself into trouble right off the bat here because I don't remember exactly which chart it was toward the end of your presentation, but I believe it showed males on the left and females on the right.
It's
and
the same one he liked.
Okay, there was a different, it seemed like the gap between males, I think it was education and related to their quality of outcome was stark, whereas for females it didn't seem to make any difference. So I was wondering what that was all about.
No, you remember it very well.
Okay.
And the chart you're describing was life expectancy by education. And the differences for men are much bigger than they are for women. And I talked about, and we find that generally, that the social gradient in health, we see it for women as well as for men, but it's shallower. And we find that, and when we look, for example, across Europe, when we did the European review, the gap in life expectancy by country is 18 years for men between Russia and Iceland, and 12 years for women. So what we see is, in general, these, what I think of as social conditions related to inequalities in health, seem to affect women less than men. And so your question is really interesting, and I've been puzzling about this for a long time, and I don't have a very satisfactory answer. So it's well spotted. One, to take the example I gave you just now, it's not the one that was on the slide, although it was a bit, that those countries with the lowest life expectancy and the biggest gaps are the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the like, Poland. And the disadvantage of being male is much bigger in those countries. The disadvantage of being male is smaller in the Western and Northern European countries. So, because that's a way of rephrasing your question. And the question is, why is that? And what we saw when looking in more detail at those, for example, at Russia, where the disadvantage of being male was much bigger than female, and particularly for men who were single, widowed, or divorced. And the disadvantage for men of being single, widowed, or divorced was bigger than the disadvantage for women. And I was discussing this with a group once, and an anthropologist said, oh, I can tell you why that's the case. Because in the former Soviet Union, you needed to work the social networks if you wanted to get the food and get the fridge fixed and somebody to come, and the women did all of that. And the men went out to work, or as my Czech colleague said, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. And the men went out to work. When men started to lose their jobs when the Soviet Union collapsed, so they no longer had the male role, and they were hopeless. The women were still working the networks. And if a man got divorced, lost his female partner, then he was socially isolated. If a woman lost a male partner, that was just one fewer child to deal with, and she'd get on with it. So I do think we need to look at male roles and female roles and sensitivity to these social conditions. So it's a long answer, but your perception was very accurate.
We'll take.
Just a quick follow-up, because we've often heard, and I think you said too, that one of the best things you can do for a society is educate the women in that society. It uplifts their lives and the whole society, and yet that one chart seemed to not exactly give that message. So that's
Well, in general, that's true, but there's this other phenomenon about the east-west gradient, which is partly what we were seeing. So that the men in Sweden and Norway and Malta and Italy, in terms of the gap between more and less education, look more like women. But when you move over to Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the gap was much bigger for men than women.
We'll have a last question from Dale here. It's a question, right?
A little different question. How would you suggest we handle cultures that say increased education distorts their culture? Let me give you an example. We have Native Americans. We have specialized religions that refuse to do that all over the world.
Well, what I said earlier, you'll remember, was that lesson number one is cultural sensitivity, but human rights should trump it. So it would depend on the situation. If they were saying, well, if we educate women, they may refuse female genital mutilation, I would be a bit less respectful of that traditional culture, because I think FGM is wrong. There you are. I'm a white supremacist. I think FGM is wrong. And so if part of that argument was don't educate us, so we want to keep doing these ghastly things to girls, and if you educate us, the women may refuse to allow these ghastly things.
That's not the issue with the natives.
Well, what I said was that I would look at the specifics of the situation. That number one lesson is be culturally sensitive. It depends what the refusing of education meant. Now, I know, looking at Australian Aboriginals, for example, where life expectancy is 15 years shorter than for non-Indigenous Australians. In the Northern Territory of Australia, where 30% are Australian Aboriginal, 82% of the prison population is Australian Aboriginal. And they say, we don't want education. We want everybody to be drunk and disorderly and sexual abuse on the fringes of benighted country towns. You go away with your ghastly education. Well, it may not be up to me, but that doesn't sound to me like bliss, really. And leave them in this wonderful culture with shocking mental health, shocking physical health, shocking treatment of children. That doesn't sound like bliss. So I think it's very important to evaluate the particular situation. So I can't answer it in a blanket way.
Well, let's thank Michael for a wonderful talk. In appreciation for which, a small token of thanks, a framed copy of the announcement of your talk, signed by the members of the General Committee on behalf of the membership. We're good.
Thank you.
Just give me a few minutes.